I actually liked X-Men Apocalypse when I first saw it. I appreciated that it felt like an ensemble movie and not another Wolverine movie where the X-Men just tag along, or a Professor X Magneto movie where the X-Men just tag along. But this movie does not work at all. In this 2-hour movie, it's a full hour before Apocalypse kidnaps Professor X and the mansion is destroyed. That's what kicks our protagonists into action. And after that, the movie thinks we have to waste time at the Weapon X facility, which kills the momentum of the story even more. The big problem is how these X-Men movies kept ignoring the status quo set up at the end of the previous movies. First Class sets up Magneto as the leader of the Brotherhood, Professor X is starting the school, and has a team of X-Men. Just kidding, they barely went a year into that status quo, and we don't get to see any of it. Days of Future Past ends with the promise that the school will be started again, Magneto flies away menacingly, okay, this time the status quo is just kidding, Magneto went and had a happy life with a family, and while the school is a thing, the X-Men as a team are not. So even though this is the 6th X-Men movie overall, and the 3rd in this prequel trilogy, this movie has to waste an hour of its screen time introducing the new X-Men who are going to save the day at the end. X-Men who we have already met in previous movies, but they still have to introduce them in this movie. But remember, in my hypothetical X-Men movieverse, we did not do a series of prequel movies. First Class was actually X-Men Origins Magneto, and didn't have the origins of the X-Men at all, and my version of Days of Future Past takes place after the events of The Last Stand, and my version of this movie will follow that. So since we've already got an established X-Men team, we won't be spending the first hour of the movie introducing everyone. So what do we do instead? My version of Days of Future Past has a post-credit scene showing Apocalypse in a technologically advanced room, awakened by the time travel old Kate Pryde did to save the future. In between movies, Apocalypse has already recruited his 4 horsemen, who in my fix were all forcefully depowered with the cure after the events of The Last Stand. Apocalypse recruiting his horsemen was another thing that really slowed down the movie. We could have had him recruit one and the others happen off screen, or do what I'm doing and have Apocalypse wake up before the movie begins and all the recruitment happens before this movie begins as well. The 4 horsemen would be completely different here. Magneto is still in prison after the events of The Last Stand, Storm is still with the X-Men, and Angel is still helping his dad run a mutant runaway center, and at least these two would not have any reason to join Apocalypse. For my horsemen, I would go with Plague or Pestilence. In the comics, she was a Morlock rescued by Apocalypse during the mutant massacre. Petra, in the comics, she was part of the first team Xavier sent to rescue the original X-Men from Krakoa. She has earthquake powers. We also have Quanon, who, long story short, switched bodies with Psylocke in the 1990s. She had some kind of psychic powers, but here, she just has normal telepathy. Incidentally, Quanon will be the only one who joined Apocalypse willingly. I don't have a backstory to explain why, but she is totally on board with him taking over the planet, and she is using her powers to influence the other horsemen so that they are more pliable in Apocalypse's hands. We will also have Polaris, Magneto's daughter. In my hypothetical timeline, Magneto left Charles in the school in 1986, a year after the school's first class enrolled. He had a wife and a daughter, who was only about 5 at the time, or a little younger. Maybe Magneto was still friends with Charles at the time, but was kinda in semi-retirement to be with his family. Then something happens, someone finds out that Magneto is a mutant, they attack his family, he uses his powers to save them, probably kills the attacker, and the wife is horrified at his brutality, and she takes their daughter and runs. Eric's wife leaving him would not be the only thing that turns him to a life of villainy, but it would be the straw that breaks the camel's back, after decades of seeing intolerance against mutants. This movie will be set in 2003, less than a year after the events of Days of Future Past, so Polaris is in her early 20s. She doesn't remember much about her dad, but she has pieced together who he was, and she wants to follow in his footsteps of becoming a mutant freedom fighter. She also sees the worst in humanity, but she doesn't have the tragedy that molded Magneto in his early years, so she's not as driven as he is. We're also going to make Apocalypse much less powerful. In the movie, he's so powerful, I have to wonder why he needs 4 horsemen anyway. He won't have the ability to absorb new powers, he's just really strong, and I guess he can shapeshift like he does in the comics, though I've always thought that looked really goofy. Instead of Maury McTaggart investigating the death cult in Egypt, we will have Rogue doing that. We've seen Wolverine and Colossus doing solo missions in the previous movies, and with Rogue being able to call up powers she acquired quite some time ago, at least in my fixes, she's ideal for going solo, since the variety of her powers means that she could handle nearly any situation. Forge recently fixed up Cerebro, so it doesn't need a telepath to use it, so the X-Men probably got a ping on Apocalypse when he woke up and started doing stuff in Egypt. If you're wondering how Apocalypse powers up his horsemen, maybe he has alien technology. I wouldn't go so far as to show the aliens in the movies, I do think that's a bridge too far, but showing weird technology in the hands of an ancient Egyptian and implying that it came from space, I'm fine with that. So maybe Apocalypse being in hibernation for a few thousand years, he's still pretty weak, and he needs a few more sessions with whatever machine he uses to repower the horsemen before he's strong enough to take over the planet. Rogue sneaks into the underground chamber and sees Apocalypse with his 4 horsemen up on some kind of stage with a bunch of humans worshipping him as he gives a speech. If Apocalypse was worshipped as a god thousands of years ago, then there would still be some remnant of the religion he was the head of, and this is where those guys would come from. Apocalypse is pleasantly surprised to see so many more mutants in this era, and he plans to build a new world order where the mutants will be be at the top of that society. Apocalypse is different from Magneto because while Eric wouldn't mind living in a woodshed once mutants are no longer persecuted, Apocalypse sees himself ruling over everyone, including humans. He doesn't want to wipe them out because then who would be the slaves of the mutants? Rogue hears all of this and she thinks Apocalypse is nuts. How could he be over 3,000 years old? But there's only 5 mutants up there, and with her training and an assortment of powers at hand, she can take them pretty easily. So Rogue attacks and she handles herself pretty well, but the horsemen are more powerful than she expected, so it's kind of a draw. Quanon tries to take over Rogue's mind, but even after Xavier died and Jean Grey went AWOL, the X-Men have kept up their training to resist telepathic attacks. Unable to stop Rogue, Apocalypse calls out to Quanon, who takes control of Petra. Petra uses her earthbending powers to create a new continent just east of Africa. It's just an island, but big enough that this causes waves all over the world. With that big of a landmass forming in the span of minutes, it causes tsunamis all across the coast of Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. Thousands are dead in minutes. Apocalypse has made his first move, but at the cost of one of his horsemen. The strain was too much for Petra. Somehow, Rogue is wounded, and Apocalypse and his horsemen flee to their new base of operations. Meanwhile, the X-Men take Rogue back home, and Wolverine is able to lend her some of his healing factor to help stabilize her, but she will be out for most of the movie. The X-Men are called in to meet with Agent Duncan, the President's man in charge of all things mutant. He's been capturing hostile mutants since the events of X3, although business has been pretty slow for him lately. But a new continent forming in minutes is big enough that he is forced to form an alliance with the X-Men, even though he hasn't been on the best of terms with them in any of the movies that he's been in. The X-Men share Rogue's intel with Duncan, and Duncan reluctantly reveals their big plan for whenever the next Magneto ever shows up: Sentinels. This will be a big oh crap moment for the X-Men because, as far as they know, they had destroyed all of the Sentinels Bolivar Trask had built in the Days of Future Past movie. The X-Men are already afraid that a mutant causing the death of thousands all over the planet will put humanity into a big anti-mutant panic, the likes of which they have never seen before, but they're afraid that the Sentinels publicly killing a mutant, even a deadly mutant terrorist like Apocalypse, is only going to result in more fear. They try to argue against sending the Sentinels, but they can't convince Duncan. Right now, the Sentinels are exactly what they need to defeat Apocalypse. Or they would be if Apocalypse didn't have his own master of magnetism on his side. When Trask started building the Sentinels, Magneto was depowered, so they never bothered reckoning with his abilities. So a big squad of Sentinels is sent to the new continent. Polaris destroys them in a big fiery explosion. While this basically wouldn't amount to anything, I like that the humans are at least trying to defeat Apocalypse instead of just sitting around hoping that someone will do something. Agent Duncan has no idea what happened, but they're not getting any readings from the area anymore. Duncan sends in a team to confirm this new threat is dealt with, led by Banshee, who was depowered back in X3 and is still working with Duncan and his team to fight evil mutants. Banshee and his team are taken by surprise. Neither Apocalypse nor any of his horsemen died in the attack. With his guard down, Quanon is able to telepathically take control of Banshee's mind, and all of his human teammates are killed. From Banshee, Apocalypse learns everything he needs to know about the X-Men and some of their recent adventures. This will be where we get Apocalypse's telepathic message to the world, kind of like the movie we got, but it's a message of mercy, sort of. Apocalypse will grant sanctuary to any and all who come to his new nation and kneel. Any who swear fealty to him will be safe from the atrocities his horsemen are about to unleash. And somehow the message will clue everyone in the world who the horsemen are, and we will see Banshee standing at Apocalypse's side, now fully repowered. Apocalypse signs off telling everyone they better hurry if they want the protection of their new god. With the failure of the Sentinels, and now this message scaring everyone even more, Cyclops tries to convince Duncan to let him and his group take care of this, but Duncan still says no. Remember, we just had a mutant almost murder a United States senator in the previous movie, and the X-Men were caught in the middle of that. Senator Kelly cleared their names, but Duncan and the rest of the government is still not quite ready to jump into bed with mutants after that. Kinda a twist on what was going on at the end of my take for X3, where the government was almost ready to force the X-Men into becoming operatives for the government. No, we're not sending the X-Men in to deal with this. Duncan has a backup plan that the president has already authorized. The X-Men see a room full of small bombs that Duncan says are filled with a distilled version of the mutant cure, which will be dispersed in aerosol form, not just across Apocalypse's island, but the entire world. While the cure is temporary, and I would say even the US government is aware of that by now, all the president's men believe they have fixed the problem with this new upgraded version of the cure. If the X-Men were mad about the Sentinels being authorized, they're definitely mad about this. You're going to depower all the mutants on the planet, good or bad, because of the actions of one man? Duncan says he has no choice. It's extreme, but if they don't disperse their new cure, this enemy could escalate the fight to a point where they won't be able to fight back. Of course, he could just send the cure to Apocalypse's island, but remember, anti-mutant panic is at an all-time high. The government has been looking for an excuse to permanently take care of the mutant problem, even going back to the previous administration. Feeling like they have no choice here, the X-Men fight Duncan and his men, and they somehow destroy the cure bombs he intended to use. They escape, but there's no turning back now. The X-Men are branded as outlaws. With the X-Men backed into a corner, Cyclops is forced to play every card he has in his hand. Remember how Jean Grey is still alive after my take on Dark Phoenix, she went away to try to put herself back together. Cyclops has been in communication with her, trying to help her through this journey, but at her own pace. But the fate of the world is at stake. Jean, we need you to come back. We would see that Jean is not exactly the same as she was before. Imagine Juliet/Eve in the TV show Grimm. She's got some memories of her previous life, mostly thanks to Cyclops allowing her to peek into his mind at his memories of her, but she is a very different person than what she was. But she knows the X-Men are her friends, so she's willing to drop what she's doing and come help. The X-Men have mixed reactions to this since the last time they saw her, she killed Professor Xavier. But Cyclops convinces them that wasn't really her fault, and they do need her. The X-Men are getting ready to abandon the school because, if you remember in X2, Magneto told William Stryker where the school was. And even though Stryker was doing his own thing there, the government knows what he knows. And since the X-Men are now not much more well-liked than Apocalypse, the school is about to become one big target. Cyclops sends all the students either back to their homes or to the sister schools located in Muir Island or Australia. We'll also find out the teams located at those schools are helping with disaster relief after the raising of Apocalypse's new continent, which explains why we won't get a dozen new characters shoved into this movie. Forge volunteers to stay behind to dismantle Cerebro. Even though he's been tweaking it for a while, it's still pretty big and bulky and will take some time to take apart. And with his modifications, the last thing the X-Men want is for the US government to have a mutant tracking device of their own. You know, sort of like what the Sentinels have access to in the future of Days of Future Past. Rogue is still in pretty bad shape. You can have Beast say that while she might be able to be moved, it would slow down the rest of the team transporting her, so Cyclops makes the call to leave her here for now, and Forge will move her and rendezvous with the rest of the group after he finishes dismantling Cerebro. Bobby, still depowered from the events of X-Men The Last Stand, will volunteer to stay behind and help Forge with Cerebro and then help relocate Rogue. After Cyclops, Jean, Beast, Storm, Wolverine, Colossus, and Kitty Pryde all leave to stop Apocalypse, some of Agent Duncan's men will storm the school. Somehow, we will say the Danger Room has been upgraded between movies, so now it can be activated at any part of the school at a moment's notice. This is something they did in Jason Aaron's Wolverine and the X-Men run to constantly keep the students on their toes, show them that an attack will not always be expected. Worst school ever, right? Anyway, Bobby activates the Danger Room to keep the soldiers at bay, while Forge finishes dismantling Cerebro. Bobby and Forge load Rogue into one of the other X-Jets, but somehow a group of soldiers find them, and somehow a misunderstanding happens. One of the soldiers sees Forge's metal hand and thinks it's a weapon, so they open fire. Bobby instinctively pushes Forge out of the way, taking the shot meant for Forge. Somehow, Rogue and Forge get away with a dying Bobby, and Bobby will make skin contact with Rogue, touching her face or something. Once Rogue realizes what he's doing, she will try to stop him, but it's too late. He knows that he's not going to make it, so he wants to find a way to be with Rogue even after death. Weird and creepy, sure, but this guy is just out of high school, even fatally wounded. He's still thinking more with his hormones than his brain. After this, Rogue will permanently have part of Bobby's mind in her own mind, in the same way that she had part of Carol Danvers' mind embedded in her own in the comics. And this would also mess with the degree of control she has over recalling powers that she's used in the previous movies. As the rest of the X-Men get ready to go fight Apocalypse, we will start hearing reports of what some of the other horsemen are doing. Apocalypse's whole deal is survival of the fittest, so he has to weed out the weak. I don't mind all the end-of-the-world disaster movie stuff in the third act of the movie, but there needed to be more story leading up to it. What we got was basically the story of the movie when you take away the Weapon X filibuster and the hour-long intro of all of our characters. But since the Age of Apocalypse storyline in the comics, Apocalypse has kind of been promoted as being one of the biggest X-Men villains, so we need to feel like the stakes are higher than ever with this movie. So cities getting destroyed, millions of people dying all over the planet, that's great as long as you commit to it. In the commentary of the movie, I Poo You Not, Bryan Singer talked about how he didn't like the destruction porn, so he would point out a group of kids running away on the bridge as it was being destroyed. No, if you can't stand the heat, get out and let someone else cook me this burger. Pestilence is somewhere spreading all kinds of awful diseases. Quanon is sticking close to Apocalypse, helping him control the other horsemen. Banshee is sent to destroy the military infrastructure, since he is more familiar with that than the other horsemen, so he would know which bases are more heavily fortified and stuff like that. And right now, they don't have any reports on what Polaris is doing. Okay, Apocalypse can wait, at least he isn't physically attacking anyone right now, but Pestilence and Banshee are. The team split up, and will say that they don't know that Quanon is telepathically controlling the horsemen, so if they just went directly to her and stopped her, that would remove the horsemen, but they don't know about that. Wolverine will be on the team attacking Pestilence, and he will get hit with all the diseases she has at hand, and nearly dies. Even with his powers, he's just barely holding on by a thread. Colossus will be on the team fighting Pestilence, and in his metal form, he doesn't have to eat or breathe, so he's basically immune to what she's throwing, and he subdues her long enough so that she can be sedated. Wolverine will be out of commission for the rest of the movie. Jean will be on the team that tracks down Banshee, who is basically moving in a straight line right to where Agent Duncan and the rest of the team is at. Jean contacts Duncan, tells him Banshee is somehow under Apocalypse's control, and that his men need to get away. Duncan doesn't listen, and the X-Men don't make it in time. Banshee has already killed Duncan and all of his former partners. A fight breaks out, but Jean is finally able to break Quanon's control. Banshee breaks down sobbing at what Apocalypse has forced him to do. He tells the X-Men Quanon read his his mind and found out about William Stryker's Weapon X facility at the bottom of Alkali Lake. Somehow, Apocalypse plans to use the Cerebro equipment Stryker built and hook it into his own machines to subjugate humanity. He sent Polaris to go retrieve the stuff that he will need. Right about now, Forge and Rogue contact Cyclops to tell him that Bobby is dead, but they did manage to get out and take Cerebro with them. Rogue tells Cyclops she wants to help somehow, even though she's not fully recovered yet. Cyclops says, no, you need to recover. If I put you back in the field, you could die too. We can't have that. But Rogue insists, and Forge says he can help with whatever Cyclops needs them to do. Alkali Lake is way on the other end of the universe, but Forge and Rogue are closer than the rest of the X-Men, and Forge has been toying with this super fast engine on this jet. So Cyclops relents and asks them to find a way to stop Polaris from bringing the old Weapon X technology to Apocalypse. Forge and Rogue will meet up with Polaris, who has raised Stryker's lab above the lake. Rogue may have some of Jean's telepathy, but like I said, absorbing Bobby's persona makes it difficult for her to maintain control. Rogue says she met Magneto, and even though he tried to kill her when they first met, he also was willing to die for mutants, and almost gave his life here at this spot to stop Stryker from exterminating their kind. She talks about how Magneto did some horrible stuff, but he would never be okay with what Polaris is helping Apocalypse prepare to do right now. Rogue breaks through. They try to convince Polaris to help them fight Apocalypse, but Polaris says no, even if you win, there's no coming back from being one of his horsemen, even a mind-controlled horseman, especially after that was telepathically broadcast to everyone on the planet. She leaves and says she will take her chances on her own, like she was before she lost her powers. Forge and Rogue rendezvous with the rest of the team, and they're ready for the big fight with Apocalypse. I won't get too detailed at this point, but all the characters who aren't dead or gravely wounded need a big moment here, and it needs to be more than, and then they all throw stuff at him at once and he's defeated. Maybe to raise the stakes, Quanon mentally nudges some of the people who have already come to serve Apocalypse, and they begin swarming the X-Men, so the X-Men have to stop those guys without hurting them and stop Apocalypse from continuing what he's doing. While most of the team is doing stuff, Jean Grey is having a psychic showdown with Quanon, and she eventually will somehow block Quanon's powers, kind of like how Professor X did for her when she was younger. Now all the X-Men can focus on Apocalypse himself, and maybe we can get Jean trying to stop Apocalypse telepathically, but he can block her like the X-Men have been trained to stop telepathic attacks themselves. Now one of the big things I did not like about the movie we got was that we don't really know anything about Apocalypse. I'm not saying we need a tragic backstory like Magneto, but we do need something, right? All the movie gives us is that he's 10,000 years old, according to Moria, and he was betrayed. So during Jean's attempted psychic attack, we can get some flashback stuff. You'd get a little bit of the Scorpion King in here, a little bit of Conan the Barbarian. Apocalypse was part of some small tribe that nobody has heard of before. They were constantly fighting wars against other nations, and finally, Apocalypse was the last of them. Maybe the war chief of whatever tribe eradicated Apocalypse's people sees that Apocalypse is different, and maybe they can use him. They take him in as a slave, he rises in the ranks of the slaves, they respect him, they revolt, start some more wars, taking in more followers as they go, and they find the alien technology that Apocalypse uses to boost his powers and those of his horsemen. Apocalypse becomes feared across the land, even by the Pharaoh. Eventually, the Pharaoh is ready to give Apocalypse and his followers their own land. Do whatever you want in your own nation, just leave us alone. Everyone is happy with that, except for Apocalypse, because he wants more. He wants the whole world. Eventually, he is betrayed like in the movie. His followers will somehow put him in the room he woke up from in Days of Future Past, and they trap him. It can be kind of like how it happened in the movie. And then being trapped slowly weakens him for a few thousand years, and like I said, the only reason he wakes up is the big power surge released when K-Pride traveled to the past or something like that. Maybe they can try using this same technique again, but it doesn't work. So instead, Banshee will end up doing the heroic sacrifice to kill Apocalypse. He grabs him and flies way up in the air, all the while screaming at him point blank. And in some of the comics, apparently his scream is powerful enough to liquefy stuff that's close by, so this would be doing some serious damage to Apocalypse. But Apocalypse still has whatever technology he used to repower his horsemen, and he turns it on Banshee, taking away his power. They fall, Banshee dies, they can't find Apocalypse's body anywhere, but with how weakened he was, there's no way he could survive that, right? I won't be bringing him back in any of my other videos, but like I said, Apocalypse is one of the big guns, so he shouldn't be defeated in one movie. This way, he's hanging on by a thread, maybe he finds some more horsemen, they nurse him back to health, and you see him again 3 or 4 movies down the line if you are going to keep getting X-Men movies in this hypothetical world. Meanwhile, we will see the President of the United States talking to Senator Kelly and a few other men in suits. We look down, the President is signing the Mutant Registration Act. I don't really know how acts actually work, but you get what I'm going for. We'll see big pictures being plastered all over the sides of buildings. Wanted posters of the X-Men, kind of like that classic Days of Future Past cover, but not the apprehended slain captions on it. We will see Bolivar Trask from the Days of Future Past movie at Alkali Lake. Forge and Rogue were able to stop Polaris from taking William Stryker's equipment to Apocalypse, but they did not have time to destroy it or put it back in the water. So now Trask will have mutant detection software of his own that he will find a way to use. As we hinted in the end of my version of Days of Future Past, that horrible future is still going to happen, and we see this movie is a big reason why. The movie ends with the X-Men preparing to go to Australia or Muir Island, 2 locations the government does not know about. This may look like they're giving up and running running away, but I would want to make it clear that while they are relocating out of the country, they will be coming back anytime there's a big crisis that needs their attention or if mutants are in jeopardy. But it will be more guerrilla superheroing and not quite as public and open about it, sort of like how they were in the time frame before the first movie. And that's my fix for X-Men Apocalypse. It's a downer ending, but the happy endings like what Days of Future Past and Apocalypse tried to do never really felt earned. The X-Men comics have like 3 awful horrible futures that different members of their ranks come from, so ending things on a big awful horrible future on the horizon feels natural. I really hope this feels like a satisfying conclusion to my hypothetical X-Men movieverse. If I was a fan watching these movies, I would be upset if this was the last one, since I moved Dark Phoenix back in time, but I'm not inventing brand new movies that didn't exist in the real world, so as far as team movies go, this is the last one for my videos. I hope you guys like this one as much as I like making it, and I do other videos on this channel, so check those out if you're interested. And even though there's a certain sense of finality to this video, things aren't quite finished for my X-Men Fix videos yet. I'll be doing a few more videos, so watch this space for something a little different next time. In the meantime, have a great week. See you next time.